We're in Detroit, Michigan, one of the most important states in one of the most important elections. The world is bracing to see whether working class voters in battleground states like this will make Kamala Harris the first female president of the United States or return Donald Trump to power. We're going to explore the issues driving the vote and what's at stake. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. On that side of the river is Canada. It seems a world away. On this side, the United States, a country deeply split over its identity and direction. That divide won't end with this election, but we will know who will be in power for the next 4 years. Donald Trump was here in Michigan yesterday. Kamala Harris will be here tomorrow. This is one of those states where, despite frantic campaigning in the final days of this race, no one seems too sure what the outcome will be. On Tuesday night here, Wednesday Australian time, we'll find out as votes are counted. It's a huge political moment with consequences for global trade, action on climate change, not to mention the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. But in this final week of campaigning, there's been more focus on the future of democracy and a whole lot of name-calling.
Probably be the most important vote you ever cast.
The final days of the 2024 race for president moving at a blistering pace.
Both candidates targeting key battleground states.
Are we ready to win?
You have to stand up and you have to tell Kamala, you're fired. Get the hell out of here.
So much is on the line in this election. In one of the most consequential elections of our lifetime.
Because they've already started cheating.
Donald Trump is even more unstable.
No one respects her. No one trusts her. No one takes her seriously. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
At the top of my list is bringing down your cost of living.
I will end inflation.
They care about their billionaire friends like Elon Musk.
We're going to bring Elon in. Anybody can land a rocket the way he landed that
I called him a dipshit, and I stand by it.
There's literally a floating island of garbage. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
None of that was an accident.
Can we all just take a chill pill and take a joke from time to time?
The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
Donald Trump is seizing on these comments.
You can't lead America if you don't love Americans. You just
I strongly disagree with any criticism of people based on who they vote for.
How do you like my garbage truck? This truck is in honor of Kamala and Joe Biden.
Turn the page on a decade of Donald Trump trying to keep us divided and afraid of each other.
The United States is now an occupied country.
We're exhausted by it. We're done with that.
November 5th, 2024 will be Liberation Day in America.
And when we fight, we win. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Well, my guest this morning is the former Australian ambassador to the United States and former Treasurer, Joe Hockey. First, let's check what's making news, starting in Australia. Labor to wipe $16 billion off student debts. The Prime Minister will today promise to wipe 20% off HECS debts for tradies and university graduates. It'll shave about $5,500 off the average student loan in a pre-election pitch to younger voters. We'll chat to Jacob Greber in Canberra about that later. In the Nine newspapers, more than 90% of flights for politicians and their staff are on Qantas, despite a rule that requires the lowest fare be chosen. Virgin is raising concerns about this, saying the preference for Qantas is costing taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. And in the final days of the campaign here, the latest figures show women are outpacing men in early voting turnout by nearly 10%. It's giving Kamala Harris's campaign optimism. USA Today reports women have so far made up 53% of early voters. The Trump campaign insists it's not concerned. The New York Times, meanwhile, reports Donald Trump is preparing to challenge the results and is already claiming the Democrats are a bunch of cheats in a repeat of his 2020 playbook. All right, well, let's get to our panel joining us here in Detroit, and a very warm welcome to Detroit, Michigan, to Farrah, Tomazin and Jade Macmillan, two correspondents covering this crazy contest and all of the United States for Australian audiences. It's great to have you with us here in Detroit. It's perhaps not as chilly as we thought it might be. It's a beautiful evening, so lovely to have you here. Look, we'll get to Michigan, what's happening in this state, what voters here are thinking, why this matters. But let's start more broadly with the final days, the final week of this contest. Farrah, what stood out to you as, I guess, the most significant moments?
I think the way in which Kamala Harris is basically, finishing off this contest. For someone who's been in this race for about 100 days, running up against someone who's been in the game for about, 9 years.
It's not long, is it, to establish yourself?
No, she's done pretty well. She's stayed on message. She's been disciplined. Donald Trump, on the other hand, has not been. In Wisconsin the other day, he essentially said that, he wants to protect women whether they like it or not. He followed that up the next day with a rally in New Mexico where he said that he won that Democratic state twice. Followed it up again yesterday by saying that, Liz Cheney ought to have guns pointed at her face. So he's been very undisciplined and unable to stay sort of on message.
Which is kind of typical of Trump, right? That looser, off-script approach that we see so often. In fact, you mentioned that comment about women. I want to play it to you because it's really quite telling. We know Kamala Harris has gone after the votes of women, focused a lot on abortion. We've seen Donald Trump chase the bros vote in response, as they say. When he tries to reach out to women, sometimes it goes like this.
Well, I'm going to do it whether the women like it or not. I'm going to protect them. I'm going to protect them from migrants coming in. I'm going to protect them from foreign countries that want to hit us with missiles and lots of other things.
Yeah, whether they like it or not, that didn't go down so well.
Not particularly. I mean, obviously, a guy who's been found liable for sexual assault, who's, bragged about grabbing women by the genitals and who is actually going to be facing sentencing in about 3 weeks for hush money paid to a porn star. So it did not go down particularly well. And I guess if Kamala Harris is trying to sort of paint this as a referendum on Donald Trump and create a bit of a contrast, she's the supposed uniter, he's the divider, he's got an enemies list, she's got a to-do list, as she keeps saying on the stump, and is really trying to bring in those centre-right Republicans who might be thinking of swaying the Nikki Haley sort of voters, so to speak.
And using Liz Cheney to do that as well.
Using Liz Cheney, I think he's not helping himself.
This gender divide's fascinating, Jade. Perhaps it's always there, and correct me if I'm wrong, women do tend to vote more than men in recent elections, or back to the 80s in the US. But we're seeing, particularly in this campaign, a pretty sharp gender divide. What difference is that going to make, do you think?
Yeah, I think the gender gap in US politics is not new. For some time now, women have tended to lean towards Democrats. But what you've got at this election is such a stark contrast. You've got Kamala Harris, who would be America's first ever female president if she wins, and she's campaigned really heavily on abortion rights. In the wake of the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade a couple of years ago, that has become a central issue for Democrats, and I think that is another way that Kamala Harris is trying to reach those women in the centre, or reach Republican women. They've highlighted a lot of cases where women who had unviable pregnancies weren't able to terminate those pregnancies because of abortion bans. And so I think she's trying to say to women who perhaps would normally vote Republican, didn't consider themselves to be all that, pro-choice, if you're using that language, before Roe fell, trying to argue that things now have gone too far and that, vote for Kamala Harris to sort of turn that around. On the other hand, you've got Donald Trump running this hyper-masculine campaign.
You got Hulk Hogan on stage.
Exactly. There's such a contrast there. I think Donald Trump is really trying to reach young men. I think young men who feel a bit ripped off in the current economic climate. We hear from young men who say that, they really like Donald Trump, that they think that he's funny or he speaks his mind when others won't. They sort of see it as a pushback against what they would consider to be, too much of a woke culture. So I think Donald Trump is really making a play for that demographic. The risk for him is that is a demographic that doesn't tend to turn out in really high numbers.
Young men don't vote so much.
He's going to the podcasters, he's going to the YouTubers, he's really trying to reach that audience where it is, but it will be really interesting to see what that turnout is like on the day.
One of the other interesting dynamics has been he is doing well amongst young men, according to the polls, young African-American men. He's doing better anyway than he did perhaps 4 years ago or the one before that. I mean, African-American as a voting bloc will still go heavily Democrat, but the polls suggest it's coming down from about 80% Democrat to about 75%, I think, is that right? And that may not sound like much, but in a tight contest, that's going to be critical. So this question of why are African-American men, some of them at least, more attracted to Trump at the moment, it's an interesting one. I did catch up with Pastor Lorenzo Sewell. He's an African-American pastor at the 180 Church here in Detroit, really poor part of town, one of the poorest communities in the country. And he's a big Trump supporter. He spoke at the rally for Trump here yesterday and at the Republican National Convention as well. And he explained to me why some African-American voters are feeling like the Democrats have taken them for granted.
In our community is we pledge our allegiance to a group of people in terms of a political platform that quite frankly exploit us, that quite frankly understand numerically they can't lose our voting block, right? So the Democratic Party knows one thing: they cannot lose the black voting block.
So if we do see this shift amongst young African-American men, how significant is that likely to be, do you think?
Look, I mean, there has been a bit of a shift. It has decreased over the last few days. I have been tracking polls to some extent. And I think what that pastor basically said is consistent with what I've been hearing sort of on the ground, that you can't just show up every 4 years and you can't just take particular voting blocks, whether it be the black vote or Latinos, for granted. I was in Georgia just the other day speaking to the head of the Democrats there, and he was making the point that under Joe Biden, this really sort of aggressive sort of push in relation to democracy and Donald Trump being a threat to democracy. He made the point that, if you are a person of colour, saying that, democracy is on fire doesn't quite resonate with them, because they're like, where have you been? For a lot of them, democracy is not working. You need to have a conversation with them about how will I pay my bills? How will I get my kid to school?
So the system hasn't worked for them for decades, and the guy that's going to break the system might have some appeal.
Yeah, exactly. And the economy is a massive issue as well for everybody. And there is a view that things were better under Donald Trump. Inflation was obviously extraordinarily high in recent times. It has obviously cooled. But there's also a perception thing, and Barack Obama goes around the country trying to make this point. Stimulus checks were given during COVID, $2,000 stimulus checks to about 70 million Americans. Donald Trump was the first president to basically sign them. So there's a perception, even though Congress passed those stimulus bills, that Donald Trump was handing out money. So, there is...
Barack Obama's intervention was interesting recently as well. He made a comment along the lines of he thought that enthusiasm among black men for Kamala Harris wasn't as high as it was when he ran for president. And he suggested that perhaps that was because there was an unease with the prospect of having a woman in the White House. Now, that sparked a bit of backlash. There were African-American Democrats, prominent people, who sort of said, why are you scapegoating our communities? This is not helpful. So I think an interesting thing to watch there as you say, the polls seem to have shifted a little bit again, but as you say, Spears, in such a tight race, any small shifts could make a difference.
Yeah, and I want to come back to Michigan and what people are saying here and why this state matters. We're going to turn now, though, to what's at stake for Australia in this election. Former Australian ambassador to the US, Joe Hockey, he now splits his time between the two countries with his US-based consulting firm, and I spoke to him a short time ago. Well, Joe Hockey, thanks so much for joining us. What's your sense of how this campaign is coming to a close? Who's having the stronger finish?
Well, I think both candidates are finishing strongly, and I think most Americans have made up their mind. It is a result that no one's able to predict. And it's going to come as a surprise to Australians, given there are so many polls that we're in a position where we can't pick the winner. But the fact is, no one knows how big the turnout is going to be. And unlike Australia, where we have compulsory turnouts in elections, here it is a mystery how many new voters will come out and how they're going to vote.
We're here in Michigan, and this is obviously one of those battleground states that Kamala Harris needs to defend for the Democrats. But where are you going to be watching? What states are you going to be keeping an eye on Tuesday night?
I'll be watching North Carolina because it's a classic case where they've got a gubernatorial, a governor candidate for governor, who has been a complete flop. This is a state Donald Trump should win and win well, but it is very close. And it's also what the Americans call a purple state. It's trending the other way. And I think North Carolina will come in early if it is a strong result for Trump. And it will be a precursor to an overall victory for Trump. But if it's close, then obviously it's going to make it a very interesting night. I'd be surprised at this stage, David, if we have a result within about 4 or 5 days. It's genuinely that close.
4 or 5 days. Well, North Carolina is interesting because they've both been spending a fair bit of time there in the last couple of days. If Kamala Harris can flip that, well, it's going to be a disastrous night for Donald Trump, I would have thought, isn't it?
Well, it wouldn't be over because North Carolina and Pennsylvania have similar number of electoral college votes. And by all accounts, Pennsylvania is very close as well. And look, let's come back to the reasons why this election is so close. It is truly based on policy differences. When you speak to strong Trump supporters or you speak to strong Harris supporters, there are different motivations to the actual candidates. For Trump supporters, they want lower tax, they want less regulation, they want a stronger border. For Harris candidates, the overwhelming unifying factor is that Kamala Harris is not Donald Trump. And that has brought together an unbelievable coalition that stretches from Bernie Sanders on the left to Liz Cheney, who would be a very, very conservative Republican on the right. I mean, that's a very broad coalition. And that's up against Donald Trump, whose coalition stretches from Elon Musk to the head of the Teamsters truck driving union. Now, you couldn't get a bigger differentiation in that cohort as well. So that's why it is such an unpredictable election this time around.
Well, those policy differences will matter enormously for the world as well. And I want to ask you about them, particularly the economy, whether it's the global trading system and the threat of more tariffs here in the United States, or indeed what their plans might mean for global growth. I know you have some concerns around what the two sides are taking to this election in terms of the economy. What worries you?
Well, if Donald Trump implements his tariff policies, it'll have a profound impact on Australia and the rest of the world. It will stimulate inflation in the United States. It'll have a dramatic impact on the US dollar. It'll have a dramatic impact on US interest rates. And there's no win out of Donald Trump's tariffs policies for anyone, including in particular the consumers here in the United States. On the other side, and the key thing about his tariff policies is they don't need congressional approval. So he can do it by executive order, as he has done before. That's what makes his tariff policies real. His tax policies need to get through the House and the Senate. And in my view, both of those chambers are going to flip. So the House will move from the Republicans to the Democrats. The Senate will move from the Democrats to the Republicans. So he won't, it's highly unlikely he will get both houses. Therefore, his tax policies can't be implemented. Whereas with Harris, if she does win, I think a lot of her constraints will come out of a likely Republican Senate. So she won't be able to implement price control, which is an absurd policy going forward. And her tax increases just won't get through the Senate.
And look, two parts of this question. Would Australia be able to negotiate an exemption to any tariffs that Trump would impose? And what about the AUKUS deal? Does that survive a Trump presidency?
Well, in relation to tariffs, we've done it before, and we've really got to have all shoulders to the wheel in prosecuting the case that Australia is a really important ally, part of the essential national security supply chain for the United States on critical minerals, rare earths, on strategic positioning involving China. And that's how we got out of it last time. And I think Trump is, I know that Donald Trump sees Australia very favourably when it comes to issues like national security. I think that'll flow through to AUKUS, that he won't want to change the relationship with AUKUS. He will, however, put a greater priority on building up the US defence system, its reservoir of not only talent, but also, importantly, the hardware, be it F-35s or Virginia-class subs. So it might mean that we go down the pecking order on the Virginia-class subs, but again, it will rely heavily on our advocacy with Trump. With Kamala Harris, there'll be a greater focus on Europe and the Middle East than there will be on the Pacific, in my view. There might not be the same US military build-up, but whatever the case, I think we'll be in a good position with Harris as well.
When it comes to those nuclear subs, I mean, are we lacking leverage here? Australia really needs whoever is the president to agree to sell those Virginia-class nuclear subs to Australia. Are we in a weak bargaining position? It sounds like you're suggesting we might have to throw more money into the industrial base in the United States.
Well, I think it's a balancing act. Firstly, we've got to see, in the case of Trump, who he appoints into the key positions like Secretary of State and Secretary of Defence. I have a feeling that they're going to be positively disposed towards Australia. That's a good starting point. Obviously, Trump sees China as the main adversary of the United States rather than Russia or even threats in the Middle East. And because he sees China as the biggest threat to US economic and national security, I think we'll be able to leverage up our relationship with him to make sure that we're at the right point in the queue for the Virginia-class subs. With Harris, it's always been the case that there. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, when we look at that relationship with China and our own backyard, the Pacific, climate change matters a great deal to the Pacific. It's their number one issue, number one concern. If Donald Trump were to come good on his threat to walk away from the Paris Agreement, drill, baby, drill, as he says, does that weaken the US position in the Pacific and strengthen China's hand?
Well, diplomatically it may, but we can't afford to have a weak United States in the Pacific. And it means that we have to double up our efforts to engage with Pacific Islands and with some of our neighbours to the immediate north. But at the end of the day, if the thing about Donald Trump is he's not afraid to exercise power, and he's not afraid to threaten to use power. And if he does that, then it actually emboldens Australia's position. It doesn't weaken it, because it means we have an entry point into that unpredictable power that others don't.
You mentioned those around Donald Trump. There is a view that without the likes of Rex Tillerson, who was his Secretary of State, Jim Mattis, who was his Defence Secretary, he's going to have acolytes around him, people who aren't going to push back and against his impulses. What do you think? Is that a legitimate concern?
No, it isn't, because they need to get Senate endorsement. And even though there might be a majority, or there's likely to be a majority of Republicans in the Senate, it won't be an easy chamber for Donald Trump. And the senators do have that massive power of confirmation. So they would want to know that the president has people who are capable, particularly in the key positions of State, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of Defence. And look, some of the people that were there last time that did survive the Trump presidency, like Steve Mnuchin, Bob Lighthizer, or Mike Pompeo in particular, Robert O'Brien, those people will be either directly in those positions or in that orbit of Donald Trump next time round. And I'll just say this, Donald Trump 2.0 won't be a hell of a lot different to Donald Trump 1.0. And that's good for us. It offers some measure of predictability. Whereas Harris will be a little less predictable because she needs to differentiate herself from the Biden presidency. And most importantly, she will always be looking to re-election. Don't forget, if Trump's elected, that's it. Even under Trump land thinking, he can only serve one more term and that's it. He can't run for re-election. Harris can run and will run for re-election if she is president, so it will be a different type of presidency.
Just finally, if Kamala Harris does win, there is a concern that Donald Trump once again won't accept defeat and that we could even, not only see challenges to the result, but even civil unrest. How concerned are you about that?
Well, I'm not so concerned about it at all. I think the moment that was most risky for civil unrest in the United States was the assassination attempt on Donald Trump in Pennsylvania. And thank God, and Democrats say this to me as well as Republicans, thank God that didn't happen, because it's going to be a moment like that that will ignite the flame of American politics, and we all hope and pray that doesn't happen. So I think Americans recognise this is democracy. It's certainly not pretty, but this democracy is working. It is the most unpredictable and closest election in American history, and no one knows the result. No one knows the implications of it with any certainty. But what we do know is there is probably going to be a record turnout of voters in the election having their say, and that's something we should all celebrate.
Well, we'll see what happens in the coming days. Joe Hockey, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, David.
And we're back to our panel here in Detroit, Michigan. We're joined once again by Farrah, Tomazin and Jade Macmillan. The sun has dropped. The temperature's dropped a little bit too. I feel like we should have packed the Insider's coffee plunger. Apologies for that.
Yeah.
Look, I want to talk a bit about what's going on here in Michigan. And I'll play you this first. Caught up with, I went along to the Trump rally that took place here yesterday, or up the road from here at Macomb County yesterday. And look, talking to them, talking to some Democrat supporters as well, just to get a sense of what the issues are driving the vote. Why are you supporting Donald Trump?
We want lower taxes, better economy, border wall closed for sure, auto workers. We need to bring all our businesses back to the U.S.
They've been fed that misinformation, and they're afraid. And that fear comes out as rage sometimes, and sometimes it just comes out as walking in the voting booth and filling in the bubble for Trump.
I love him because he's the boss, because everything he says is right, and he's going to make America great again.
I worry about the U.S.'s position in the world, and so it's incredibly frightening.
So, Jade, Michigan, similar in many ways to Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. These three states do tend to go together at election time. A lot of middle-class, working-class voters, and it does sound like cost of living, the economy, jobs is really up there at number one here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the issues that really matter to people here are similar to those that we're really hearing from people in all of the swing states. The economy, cost of living is right up there. I think people do care a lot about immigration. As you said, Spears, we're nowhere near the US southern border. That's Canada right there. But Republicans have this line that every state now is a border state, and Donald Trump has made it so central to his campaign. I think abortion is really up there as well. You know, there is not an abortion ban in Michigan. It's not on the ballot like it is in some other states like Arizona, where Democrats are really hoping it will help to drive up turnout. But even, you know, speaking to people at an early polling place here earlier today, and keeping in mind Detroit, as many large cities sort of tend to lean towards the Democrats well.
The vote here in Detroit, to be clear, was something like 94, 95% for Joe Biden. 4 years ago. So Detroit itself is very strong,
No, exactly.
strong Democrat. But Trump might be able to peel some of that back and do better in other parts of the state.
Yeah, and I think even, I think in states where it's not so much that issue is really front and centre at a state level, it is still something that people are thinking about. But the economy is just so huge, and I think one of Donald Trump's most powerful lines is that one that when he says at the top of all of his rallies, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
Well, it's an old political chestnut, but yeah, it's the first thing he says when I was at that rally yesterday. First thing he says, and you get an obvious response: no, people don't feel better than they did 4 years ago. And have the Democrats done enough to counter that? Do you think, Farrah?
Well, I mean, I think there are signs of the, the workers' vote for actually for Kamala Harris. You mentioned Joe Biden's vote here in Detroit. I mean, he was seen as a very pro-union president. For Kamala Harris, it's notable that she did not get the support of the Teamsters Union, which is one of the biggest unions in the country.
Why is that?
They simply were split. They did not endorse a candidate for the first time in many years. She didn't get the support of the Firefighters Union here. She did get the support of the United Auto Workers Union. She has been obviously trying to make some inroads. Another issue that I think really relates to people here is, the Biden administration's push for EV vehicles. When Stellantis, the car company here that makes Chrysler and other vehicles closed jobs at its Warrenwood plant, there were some people who blamed, Joe Biden's
that's
EV
interesting,
policies.
yeah. And this is Motor City, as it's called, Detroit. A lot of auto workers here, so yeah, it's a sensitive one.
And I think obviously we can't, go past the issue of Gaza. We're right near.
And I want to come to that because I did catch up with some of the community there on that. But on that immigration issue, it's really interesting how it's linked to jobs. And Pastor Saul at the church that we heard from earlier, I want to show you this because he argues that illegal immigrants are taking the jobs of members of his congregation.
Him talking about immigration. That's not a popular subject, right? But I have 28 Venezuelans that come to this church that get resources to this church that take away black jobs from this church. That has happened just in the recent 6 months, right here in this own community.
Now, he's a strong Trump supporter. You can hear more from him on the podcast where we've got more from Lorenzo Sewell. But also, I caught up, as mentioned, with Imad Hamad. He's a Arab-American community leader and just up the road from here, Dearborn has the largest Arab-American community in the country. And unsurprisingly, they're not happy with the US approach supporting Israel and its war with Gaza and war in Gaza and war in Lebanon now as well. They're concerned about both Joe Biden, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump for taking such a pro-Israel position. And Imad told me that he's advocating in his community a vote for a third-party candidate, Jill Stein from the Greens.
I understand that the Democratic Party are annoyed, they are not happy that many in our community is going to cast vote for Jill Stein. They see it as a waste of time. They see it as a way that could support former President Trump. But that's not our business. That's not our making. You guys had the opportunity to do what is right. We didn't expect from you to do miracles.
Now, again, that's a voting bloc. It's a significant bloc in Michigan. They've typically gone Democrat. Is that going to make a difference, do you think, now?
It could potentially. I mean, and this person is sort of, resonating, articulating very similar things to what other people in Dearborn are saying. I was there recently and spoke to someone who had his father basically bought a condominium in Lebanon, and that condominium is now sitting in rubble as a result of Israel strikes. He made the point that he's either going to pick a third-party candidate or sit it out because he can't fathom the idea of having to potentially pay taxes to an administration that is supplying weapons to a war that's affecting his family, and that is something that many people
feel very strongly about. It's interesting. Donald Trump went there to Dearborn just yesterday after he did the rally in Macomb. He says he'll end the war quickly. I said to Imad, what do you think that means? Is he going to give Israel more licence to go even harder to end the war? But it's a little unclear. And what do you think? Are they likely to vote for Donald Trump?
I think there are some people who say that they will either vote for Donald Trump, they will vote for a third-party candidate, or they won't vote at all. And if that means either of those things means that Donald Trump comes back to power, then that is what they feel they need to do to send a message to the Democrats. Democrats are showing signs that they're worried that, votes for Jill Stein could affect the outcome in a very tight tight race. They've been running an ad where Jill Stein's face morphs into Donald Trump's. You know, Democrats have argued that she took votes away from Hillary Clinton in 2016, and they've argued that she'd be a spoiler this time around. But I think at least some people feel so strongly about this, they cannot, they feel as though they cannot vote for Kamala Harris, that if Donald Trump returns because of that, that's something that they're willing to see happen.
I'll come back to you both in a moment. I also want to check in on a couple of the other swing states that are in play to see whether similar issues are playing out there. Our correspondents on the ground, Isabella Higgins, is in the Sunbelt state of Arizona. Michael Rowland is in Pennsylvania. First to you, Isabella. What are the issues you're picking up there in Arizona?
Well, David, on the ground here in Arizona, you do get the sense that this is a divided state. For every Republican you meet, there's a Democratic voter, and they seem to both have really strong views of the candidates. Arizona's an interesting place. Once reliably Republican, Joe Biden was the first Democratic candidate to win this state since the 1990s, and it was one of the smallest margins in the country. Now, people say perhaps the reason voting trends have changed here is because of the change in demographics, a lot of movement from other states in the US here for the cheaper cost of living, but also particularly the growth in the Latina community. Now, it's estimated to be about a third of the population here, and we've heard some strategists say that whoever wins the Latina vote in Arizona wins Arizona. And we've really seen, particularly this week, the Harris campaign here targeting that vote. Now, when I was out speaking to voters about how they decided who they wanted as president, there were pretty simple reasons. The Democrat voters said that they were really excited about the idea of the first female president, and they supported her stance on women's reproductive issues. And particularly amongst the Latina community, they said they preferred her approach and her language to border and immigration. This is, of course, a state that shares a border with Mexico. And for the community here, there are many people who have family members in Central and Southern America, so those issues around immigration are really real and live for them. Now, the Republican voters say simply they think Trump is better for the economy and tougher on borders. And that was a sentiment that was repeated by some second and third generation Hispanic voters as well. Now, when I was out talking to people in Scottsdale earlier today, I have to say that the views were pretty mixed.
Kamala is not smart enough to run the country.
But I am feeling a little hesitant because of what happened last time he ran.
How do you feel about the 2020 election and what happened?
I feel Trump actually won it.
You know, there's a lot of people for Trump, but I do not want to see 4 more years of that.
She can make better decisions than he can, and I think he's more in for himself.
I voted for Vice President Harris because I really believe in having a woman president.
Isabella Higgins in Arizona, thank you. And boy, it looks a little warmer in Arizona than it is here, and probably in Pennsylvania too. Michael Rowland, you're on the ground there. What are you picking up? What are you detecting are the issues likely to decide the outcome in Pennsylvania?
Very much the economy, as you were speaking with the panel earlier, along with all the other so-called blue wall states. It is the economy, cost of living that are driving a lot of the votes in this key swing state. Pennsylvania has been absolutely buffeted by manufacturing job losses in recent years. People have left this state to seek better economic opportunities elsewhere, and its economy therefore has suffered. So the candidates, be it Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, who can address those cost of living concerns, those bread and butter issues in a better way, is going to stand a better chance of picking up the swing state and its 19 electoral college votes. The Trump supporters we caught up with today, David, say they felt better economically under his first term than they have done over the last 3.5 years of Joe Biden's presidency. The Democrat supporters say they are attracted to Kamala Harris's strong message on abortion, her attacking Donald Trump for his role in overturning a woman's legal right to abortion. Both candidates have been absolutely blitzing this state. Donald Trump will be here tomorrow, in fact, just up the road from me at a small town in central Pennsylvania. Kamala Harris has been here in the last couple of days. They will both spend pretty much the last 24 hours blitzing this state because pretty much, David, whoever wins Pennsylvania goes a long way towards winning the White House. I caught up with voters here in Harrisburg, the state capital of Pennsylvania, early today, and as with Isabella in Arizona, opinions were certainly mixed.
Inequality is one of the defining problems of this time in America. I think it's causing a lot of distrust of institutions and between people. And I trust Kamala to deal with that better than I do Trump.
Trump had 4 years and did well. That's all I can say. Proven track record.
Not necessarily like a Harris supporter. I will vote for her. As a contrast to Trump.
If I'm a businessman, I would support Donald Trump. As a regular living person in today's world and reality of the economy, I'd have to go with Kamala Harris, only because I'd have a hope and a dream that she would turn this around.
Michael Rowland, thank you very much in Pennsylvania. Well, back to Farrah, Tomazin and Jade Macmillan. This brings us to Tuesday night, or Wednesday Australian time, as the votes are being counted and what we're likely to see. There's not much point really making predictions given how close it is, whichever swing state you go to. But is there a chance, a good chance, Farrah, that we see Donald Trump once again claim victory early in the night, even if it's still unclear?
I think there's an excellent chance of that. Right. Kamala Harris, her campaigners are already briefing reporters about the possibility of that and what their sort of game plan is, and that is really to sort of flood the zone with messaging for people to stay calm and then that, it's going to be okay. He's been saying doubt about this election for quite some time, just as he did in 2022. He's, using phrases like we've got to make sure it's too big to rig, or the only way that the Democrats will win is if they cheat. He's got election denying allies in various states doing all sorts of dubious things. I was just in Georgia and some of his election denying allies were trying to change the certification processes to basically possibly delay the count. The courts have fortunately pushed back on that, but I would expect all sorts of things to happen. There are already 196 challenges.
I was going to say, it's a huge number of legal challenges happening at the local level over this and that, and with voter registrations here and there. Some of them have been knocked back already, but some of them are still playing out. And Jade, worth pointing out that electoral laws have been tightened, haven't they, since 2020, that might make it harder to overturn an election?
I think at the very least, Kamala Harris's campaign, as Farrah said, is well aware that this is how it could play out. They are prepared for Donald Trump to, on the night, as he did preemptively back in 2020, to claim that he won the election. I think at a state and local level, officials have really been trying to combat misinformation. They have been trying to sort of be as transparent as they can in a number of areas about how long the vote might take, how long the count might take, because in a state like Pennsylvania, they can't start counting the mail-in ballots until the day of the election. And early voting is so popular here now, like it is in Australia, that if you have a situation where it takes several days to kind of call an outcome in a state as critical as Pennsylvania, then that is a lot of time where Donald Trump and his allies can claim that something has gone wrong. And there is this sort of effect of a red mirage, if mail-in ballots tend to favour Democrats, which isn't totally clear whether that will happen this time around, then he could sort of try and argue on the night that things are looking good for him, and then if it turns the other way in the days afterwards, he will argue that something has gone wrong there. Yeah, and I mean, you often talk to Donald Trump supporters and you ask them the very simple question of, do you think he can win the election? And they will tell you if the other side doesn't cheat. That is really echoed at the ground level.
I asked a lot of those Trump supporters at the rally, would you accept a Kamala Harris win? Some of them did say yes, we have to respect the system, but a lot of them were saying, well, as you say, as long as she's not cheating, we have to make sure every state is certified correctly, and this is really filtered through. What about the flip side? If Trump wins legitimately, will Kamala Harris and the Democrats accept that?
Yes.
You think so? Is that clear?
I believe so. I mean, unless it's, I don't see any reason why they wouldn't.
I think if it's incredibly close, you will see legal challenges perhaps on both sides, demands for recounts. Like the way the US system works is that you've got to have that certification at the local, the state, the national level. It's a complicated process. So I'm sure both sides are getting ready for that. But
I guess the more complicated question is, given how divided, how polarised the country is, whichever way it goes, is this election going to unify the country at all, or is it going to exacerbate that division?
I don't think it's going to unify the country necessarily. It'll always be sort of a divided country. I mean, it's been that way for quite some time.
But it is getting worse. And if Trump were to win, Kamala Harris has been saying he's a threat to democracy, talking about his dictator for a day comments and so on. Will her supporters, will Democrat voters be deeply worried?
Oh, look, I think so, but I think that there also may be, if indeed Donald Trump does happen to lose this election, and we've got to remember this will be his fourth loss. He lost the 2018 midterms, he lost in 2020 the presidency, he lost in 2022 when the red wave did not materialise at the midterm elections. If this is his fourth loss, there may well be a kind of reckoning within the GOP about the sort of Donald Trump factor and the hold that he's got within the party. So
I mean, that's fascinating. Whether they continue down the MAGA path with someone else like J.D. Vance, or whether they course correct back to the Reagan Republican model or not. But just on that question, Jade, of what we're likely to see, whichever way it goes, if it's as tight as the polls suggest, and it's either Kamala by a nose or Trump by a nose, does this country remain deeply divided? Does it get even worse?
I think it's hard to see either of these candidates, regardless of the result, really being able to bring Americans together. This country, there's so much to love about the United States. It's been a privilege to work and live here, but it is very polarised, and both sides are trying to frame this election as, the other side presenting a real threat to the future of the nation. And so whoever wins, you're going to have a significant proportion of the population deeply unhappy with the outcome. And I really just don't see how you bridge that gap.
Well, we will see. I want to come back to you both for some final observations shortly. I want to also, though, check in now on what's happening in Australian politics, and the ABC's Jacob Greber joins me now from Canberra. Jacob, big news this morning. The PM's going to be making a further promise today to help those workers, young workers in particular, saddled with big HECS debts. What does today's promise involve?
So this is step two of what's been a two-step sort of set of announcements over this weekend, David. The first one, as you said yesterday, was news that the government would be shifting the income level at which you start to repay your student loan, whether you're a tradie paying off your loan for TAFE or a university student. That will now kick in at about $67,000. It was in the 50s. And they'll also be changing the indexation arrangement to reflect where wages go rather than inflation goes. And today the Prime Minister is backing that up with an announcement that he'll be cutting student debt by 20%. Now, for someone on with about $70,000 worth of debt, so this would be the sort of more extreme end of the scale, they'll get a reduction of about $12,000, and that scales down the less debt you have. But it's a significant announcement, will certainly become a big political fight, because the Prime Minister says this will only happen if you vote for Labor, and Labor wins the next election. They'll then pass this and bring it in middle of next year.
Yeah, it's a real big pitch, or his first big pitch for young voters, and tackling intergenerational inequity, I suppose, as well. Big part of his second term agenda there. How responsible is it, Jacob? What are economists saying?
So it really is a pitch directly at young voters. Labor, with a primary in the 30s or high 20s, obviously needs to bring young voters on board. They're worried about slippage to the Greens. This is very much aimed at that young Gen Y, Gen X cohort. Gen Y and millennial cohort. It's also not necessarily as straightforward and as attractive as it might sound. Remember, this is debt that still needs to be repaid, and it is debt that will end up being repaid by all taxpayers. And it's debt that was obviously incurred by people who tend to go on to have higher incomes, roughly 1/3 more income over their life compared to someone without one of these qualifications. And it's really interesting that in the United States, you've had this debate rolling for years. Biden made it a big part of his 2020 election pitch. The Republicans pushed back very hard on that, saying that it was unfair for lower income people who continue to pay taxes to pay off these debts. So I'm sure we're going to see, David, that debate unfold here in Australia over the next months.
The big political story all week, Jacob, seemed to be flight upgrades. The PM denied breaking any rules. He denied asking Qantas specifically for any freebies. And then we saw some focus on the coalition side as well, where Bridget McKenzie had some upgrades and questions of whether they were declared properly. And Peter Dutton asking Gina Rinehart to use her private plane. Look, where's the dust settled on all of that? Is this going to be an issue when Parliament's back tomorrow?
It's going to be fascinating, David. I think Monday, Tuesday, before the US election completely takes over the news cycle, there'll be a bunch of question times. Now, the Prime Minister has said through his media office that he did not do that. He did not solicit flights from the former Qantas CEO. The journalist who made that claim, Joe Aston, he stands by his story, is my understanding. So I think the opposition will want to get the Prime Minister making that point in Parliament, where the rules apply, obviously. And the concern for the Prime Minister will be if there's any other kind of way that might have happened, any piece of paper, any email, all the rest of it, he'll want to be very certain that that it's all squared away. But on the other side, David, the government is up for a fight on this. They are talking about how others have problems. Peter Dutton has this issue, as you alluded to, with flights paid for by Gina Rinehart, and we're obviously also waiting on Bridget McKenzie, who is the opposition transport spokesperson. She has asked the big three airlines to send her all their logs so she can be sure. So that space is very much active. The government's up for a fight on this. And David, this is one of these sort of political fights. Expenses, they all head to the same place, which is generally down in the bottom of the sump where everyone's covered in mud.
Exactly, not good for either side ultimately often. Look, a final one quickly, Jacob. We've been talking a lot about cost of living, big issue in the election here, and clearly I suspect it's going to be a bigger issue than flight upgrades at the Australian election when it rolls around next year. We did see some inflation figures the other day. What do they tell us?
So they're telling us, obviously, headline is down quite sharply, and that's due to the effects of all the energy price relief that has come through in that September quarter. But they also show that some of the measures of core inflation are cooling. They're not yet in the sort of place where the Reserve Bank can cut. They're still above their 2 to 3% target. But David, a lot of economists now are starting to speculate much more that by February, those numbers will be back where they make sense. The Reserve Bank, is expected to move before inflation is all the way down, because the current level of monetary policy is squeezing the economy. So you have an interesting scenario for political decision makers at the beginning of next year. If there's a rate cut in February, there could be another one then at the subsequent meeting in April. A Prime Minister who calls an election around that period might be hoping that that gives him the sort of tailwind he needs, that cheers people up, especially those with mortgages, and gets the discussion off these awkward topics like flight upgrades.
Yeah, indeed. And we know Peter Dutton will be running the line. Donald Trump is, do you feel better now than you did 3 years ago? Jacob, thanks so much for the update and analysis on all of that. We're going to get some final thoughts from our panel in just a moment. Time now, though, for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with cartoonist for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Cathy Wilcox, and a very warm welcome.
Good morning, Mike, and it's lovely to be here.
Cathy, politicians from all sides were scoring frequent liar miles.
Oh my goodness, a whole lot of people walking around pointing and throwing stones, and it turned out the walls were made of glass.
Peter Brolman has picked up on this. He's looking at the bright side, of course. Well, the good news is they're no longer calling you Airbus Elbow as they're painting Upgrade Elbow.
Upgrade Elbow.
Yeah.
Oh, look, it's good to have a name.
That's exactly right. I thought Batuta Advocate just got the message absolutely right, because I reckon you'd have this sort of energy on an Armidale flight, wouldn't you?
Right. So Barnaby defends receiving free upgrades on RECs that included being able to lie down in the aisle, fly the plane for a bit, and vape.
I think it's beautiful.
I've flown RECs, and it's it's
got that
casual,
energy,
it's
right?
friendly. Yeah.
You've picked up on some of the hypocrisy that may or may not be involved in this, Cathy.
At least he's not burdening the taxpayer with these flights.
Well, of course, yes. Look who's getting an upgrade as he's on the knee of Gina. Similar sort of energy with Harry Bruce's cartoon. He's got Peter Dutton here hanging out of the Rinehart airplane going tisk, tisk. This sort of just plays really badly with the public, doesn't it?
Yeah. You go back and forth and you say, sure, I'm not defending that, but, on the other hand...
I do it too.
Yeah, that's right.
David Rowe has Hypocrisy Flight 101. Pull up, Bridget, pull up.
There's almost something kind of meta about actually putting the word hypocrisy on a cartoon, because
that's your job.
That's the job.
I thought Johannes has absolutely nailed it here.
Yep.
He's got all of the pigs with their snout in the trough. Disgusting behaviour by Albo, says one of the pigs.
Oh, the greedy pig could ruin it for the rest of us. That's what everybody's been saying. You know, don't blame Albo, blame the system. They all do it.
They all do it. And Matt Golding here has picked up on the advertising campaign for Qantas.
Oh, look, and they're all lined up and ready to sing.
Yeah. We've been to lounges that never close down, from Sydney to Melbourne and old Canberra town. But no matter how far from integrity we roam, we still call the Chairman's Lounge home.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Cathy, it seems to me like the Halloweens lasted for over a year in the US with the election campaign.
There's only a few days, and I really feel like I can't say anything funny about it at all anymore.
It's beyond satire. Dean Alston from the West Australian, trick like your freebie upgrades or treat? And from inside the house.
Who is it, Anthony?
Just a ghoul.
Just a ghoul.
Yeah.
And there's Albo in his Qantas
free
junior
pyjamas
jams and his Yes badge and all the rest of it.
Trick or Trump? Mark Knight's cartoon.
Make the scary man go away.
Fiona Katauskas has picked up on the scariness of some of the costumes for Halloween. Maybe we should have chosen costumes that were a little less scary.
Yeah. Oh dear. President-elect. And oh dear.
Go away. The NAC seem to have a knack for pulling the wrong lever continually, Cathy.
So what we need is a national anti-corruption commission
to look
into the National Anti-Corruption Commission.
The knack of the NAC.
The NAC, yeah.
And John Kudelka has picked up on this beautifully, the NAC and how it works.
The perceived conflict of interest, which happens to have emanated from the NAC here.
Yeah.
And then we've got an inspector. NAC inspect or reviews the proceedings.
Yep.
And then 3, the matter is referred back to the NAC.
Yeah.
Yes,
which
indeed.
is back here.
Yeah.
Well, I noticed the dog has no teeth.
And this does not look like a very scary watchdog either, for that matter.
You've got a take on the NAC here. Cathy, run us through it.
The Commissioner, Brereton, is being handed another referral to the Anti-Corruption Commission, a NAC Commissioner misconduct over robo-debt referral, and he says, I may have a connection with this chap.
It's all about perceptions. Cathy, it's been a great pleasure unpicking events this week with you, and I'll let you do the honours.
Thanks, Mike. It's been fun to be here. And back to you, David.
Thank you, Cathy. Thank you, Mike. Well, let's get some final observations from our panel here in Detroit. Farrah, first to you.
When the dust settles on the results of this election, it'll be interesting to see to what extent there was indeed a shy Kamala Harris vote, just as there were the shy Trump vote of 2016. Second thought is Nikki Haley, 2028.
Interesting. That talk will start, no doubt about it, because whether he wins or loses, someone else will have to run in 4 years' time for the Republicans. Jade.
I think this race is obviously all about Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, but the outcome will have an impact on how Joe Biden's political legacy is viewed. If Kamala Harris wins, he'll be seen by his party as the president that picked her to be his VP, that stepped aside to let her run. If she loses, there'll be big questions about whether he left it too late, whether he should have stuck to his original suggestion that he'd be a transitional leader only.
And also his not so helpful comment about garbage the other day as well. Hey, we've watched the sun go down here in Detroit and that temperature drop. Thank you for bearing with the chilly weather, but wonderful to be here in Michigan as well. Good luck with the final few days. It could be more than just a few days. You might have a fair bit of work to do in a week or two ahead. So thanks so much for joining us. And do join us on Wednesday, Australian time, for the USA Votes Live count from 10 a.m. We'll have the coverage. That's Australian Eastern Standard Time, 10 a.m. Jeremy Fernandez, Bridget Brennan, Casey Briggs, they'll be there bringing you the latest results as they come in. I'll be joining live from Washington, D.C. as well. Thanks to all the team here in Detroit too for making this happen for you this morning, here tonight for us. Now finally, a debate was also held between those third-party candidates who are running for president. It was broadcast live to air, but someone clearly thought it was being taped. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
We're so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare. Can I go back? Can I go back? back, please.
Bye.
Bombs bursting, and I got too nervous.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.